In the spring of 1962, a strange document began circulating at the highest levels of the US military. It wasn't just another Cold War memo or a routine intelligence briefing. This one proposed a series of carefully orchestrated disasters, plane hijackings, bombings, staged attacks on American citizens, and all of it was meant to be blamed on Cuba. The purpose? To create a public outcry that would justify a full-scale military invasion of the island. The name of the plan was Operation Northwoods, and its contents remain some of the most chilling ever declassified. At the time, the United States was locked in an escalating standoff with Fidel Castro's communist regime. Castro had overthrown a US-backed dictator just a few years earlier and was now growing closer to the Soviet Union. Washington considered him a serious threat. After the embarrassment of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which had attempted and failed to oust Castro, the appetite among military officials for stronger action was growing. But public support for another aggressive move wasn't guaranteed. That's where Operation Northwoods came in. The proposal came directly from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking officers of the US military. The chairman at the time was General Lyman Lemnitzer, a respected and influential figure. Under his direction, the Department of Defense drafted a list of potential provocations designed to manipulate public opinion by fabricating Cuban aggression. These were not vague suggestions. They were detailed, step-by-step plans with timelines, logistics, and possible casualties. One scenario called for the US to fake an attack on its own naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which would be presented as an act of Cuban sabotage. Another idea involved hijacking American commercial planes and simulating their destruction over Cuban waters. The most elaborate version even proposed using a drone aircraft disguised as a passenger jet, packed with a believable flight manifest, only to be remotely destroyed mid-air. The public would be told that Cuban missiles had shot down a civilian flight. The document also outlined ways to create terror within American cities. Bombs would be planted in Miami or Washington, and evidence would conveniently point to Cuban operatives. American citizens might be injured or killed, but that was considered acceptable collateral damage in the name of national interest. The authors of the proposal suggested faking funerals, broadcasting emotional news coverage, and manipulating newspapers to stir anti-Castro sentiment. What's particularly jarring is how normal all of this sounded on paper. The tone of the document is cold and bureaucratic, filled with military jargon and sterile language. There is no moral wrestling, no hint of doubt, just clinical planning of how to provoke war by deceiving the American public. The underlying philosophy was clear. If people won't support a war naturally, then give them a reason to. This wasn't the brainstorm of a rogue agent or the fringe ideas of a secret cabal. It was produced and endorsed by the most senior military leaders in the United States. Their signatures were on it. The document was handed to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and was expected to be forwarded to President John F. Kennedy. What's remarkable is how close this came to being implemented. Had Kennedy approved it, the US might have launched a war based on a lie, one crafted not by a foreign enemy but by its own generals. But Kennedy didn't approve it. He reportedly rejected the plan outright, disturbed by the extreme measures it proposed. Within months, General Lemnitzer was reassigned and removed from his post as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Operation Northwoods was buried and forgotten, a grim footnote never meant to see the light of day. It wasn't until the 1990s, when files were declassified during an investigation into JFK's assassination, that the public first learned the full extent of what had been planned. The revelation sparked a wave of disbelief. For years, conspiracy theorists had claimed that governments sometimes stage events to push agendas. Now, here was documented proof that such an idea wasn't just a theory. It had been proposed, written down, and formally submitted by the US military. The line between defense and manipulation had nearly vanished. In the decades since, Operation Northwoods has remained a powerful example of how national security can be twisted into something dangerous. It raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of power, the limits of patriotism, and the vulnerability of public trust. It's a reminder that not all threats to democracy come from the outside. Some are drafted in silence, inside quiet offices waiting for a signature, The declassification of Operation Northwoods in the 1990s pulled back the curtain on a moment in history that few could have imagined. In a time defined by espionage, paranoia, and ideological warfare, the document laid bare how far military planners were willing to go to shape world events. The fact that American leadership stopped it in its tracks is a testament to the delicate balance between military ambition and civilian oversight, a balance that was nearly overturned. After Kennedy's rejection of the proposal, General Lyman Lemnitzer, the man behind the plan, was quietly shuffled away from the Joint Chiefs and reassigned to NATO. Officially, there was no scandal, no public explanation. The explosive nature of the memo was hidden behind layers of secrecy. For decades, it was buried in archives, its details unknown even to most historians. Only a handful of insiders knew that, for a brief moment, the US government had entertained a blueprint for manufacturing a war through deception. When the files were released as part of the JFK Assassination Records Review Board's investigation, they shocked researchers. Operation Northwoods wasn't just theoretical, it was formally recommended and documented with chilling precision. There were memos, signatures, and even logistics for how to create believable casualties. It wasn't fiction, it wasn't rumor, it was real. And it led many to ask the obvious. If this plan had gone ahead, how would history have changed? The mere idea that American citizens might have been harmed, or made to believe they were harmed, to achieve a foreign policy objective shattered illusions. It exposed the potential for manipulation at the highest levels of government. If the military could suggest staging terror attacks to build support for a war, what else might have been on the table at other moments in history? And yet, there was no public reckoning, no hearings, no resignations. Operation Northwoods faded into the background as a bizarre historical footnote, often overlooked in discussions of Cold War policy, but its implications linger. It revealed a structural willingness within parts of the government to use the very tools of democracy, freedom of the press, patriotism, public emotion, as weapons against the people they were meant to serve. At its core, Operation Northwoods was about control, not military conquest, but narrative control. It aimed to direct the headlines, the outrage, the political pressure. By carefully staging tragedy and guiding blame, the architects hoped to corner both the American public and the international community into supporting a war. It was psychological warfare of the most dangerous kind, not against an enemy, but against the American mind. Interestingly, Operation Northwoods was just one piece of a larger pattern of Cold War covert operations. The US and the Soviet Union both engaged in proxy wars, espionage, coups, and propaganda on a global scale. But what made Northwoods different was its domestic target. This wasn't about regime change in Iran or Latin America, it was about deception on home soil. In hindsight, Kennedy's rejection of the plan took courage. At the time, he was under immense pressure to act decisively against Castro. The Bay of Pigs had failed. Cuba had aligned with the Soviets, and soon, in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. Saying no to Northwoods meant resisting a powerful tide of military consensus. Kennedy's refusal may have helped preserve a crucial boundary between strategy and morality. Operation Northwoods also serves as a reminder of the importance of transparency in democratic systems. The plan only became public because of a law requiring the release of documents related to Kennedy's assassination. If not for that legal mechanism, we might still be in the dark. It raises a simple but profound question. How many other proposals were never uncovered? What else remains sealed behind top-secret stamps, hidden from the public record? The story of Northwoods forces us to confront a reality that is both unsettling and essential. Democratic governments are not immune to dangerous ideas. Sometimes the threat isn't an outside enemy, but an internal culture of fear, secrecy, and ambition. That's why the public's role, asking questions, demanding accountability, and studying history, remains critical. Today, Operation Northwoods is cited occasionally in discussions of government overreach or false flag theories, but it's more than that. It is a historical document that challenges our assumptions about power. It shows that even in the most trusted institutions, extreme proposals can arise, and sometimes it's only a single decision that stops them from becoming reality. It's easy to assume that history always follows a rational path, that democracies correct themselves, and that unethical plans are weeded out before they take root. Operation Northwoods proves other. In the shadowy corridors of South America's military dictatorships during the 1970s, a chilling secret alliance took shape. Known as Operation Condor, it was a multinational campaign of political repression, intelligence sharing, and covert assassination. Behind closed doors, right-wing regimes from Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia agreed to work together, not just to maintain power, but to eliminate anyone they saw as a threat. Dissidents, exiles, intellectuals, and even the families of political opponents became targets. Condor's mission wasn't just to silence opposition, it was to erase it from existence. This operation didn't start as a formal plan written down in some secret treaty. It evolved out of necessity, or so its architects believed. One by one, throughout the 1960s and 70s, South American nations fell under the control of military juntas. These regimes justified their brutal grip on power by invoking the spectre of communism. The Cold War had turned Latin America into a battleground of ideologies, and for these generals, survival meant treating any sign of leftist resistance as a threat to national security. But their reach only went so far until they joined forces. In 1975, intelligence officials from 6 countries met in Santiago, Chile. Their goal was to formalize cooperation on tracking, exchanging, and eliminating political enemies across borders. If a Chilean dissident fled to Argentina, Condor would ensure they were found, captured, or killed. If an Uruguayan activist was hiding in Brazil, that too could be arranged. The operation allowed military governments to bypass borders, legal systems, and human rights, all in the name of security. The origins of the alliance were deeply tied to Chile's infamous coup in 1973. When General Augusto Pinochet overthrew democratically elected President Salvador Allende with the backing of the Chilean military, a dark precedent was set. Pinochet quickly rounded up political opponents, intellectuals, and union leaders. Thousands were imprisoned, tortured, or disappeared. His regime's intelligence agency, the DINA, became a model for Condor's future operations. Ruthless and efficient, DINA served as the central hub in the early days of the network. Though largely unknown to the public at the time, the United States was not just aware of these regimes, it was deeply involved. US foreign policy during the Cold War prioritized the containment of communism above all else. Declassified documents later revealed that American intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, maintained contact with several of the Condor nations. While direct involvement in the assassinations remains debated, the US provided technical support, surveillance tools, and intelligence training to many of the region's security forces. The message was clear: as long as they fought communism, they had Washington's blessing. The methods used by Condor were terrifying in their scope and cruelty. Dissidents were abducted in the middle of the night, held in secret detention centers, and tortured for information. Sometimes for days, sometimes for months. Many never emerged. Victims were often loaded onto aircraft and thrown into the ocean, a practice chillingly known as the death flights. Others were found murdered on foreign soil, their deaths staged to look like accidents or random violence. One of the most notorious cases involved Orlando Letelier, a former Chilean ambassador under Allende who had gone into exile in Washington, D.C. In 1976, Letelier was killed in a car bomb explosion just blocks from the White House. The attack was orchestrated by DINA agents with the help of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. Letelier's death wasn't just a message to Chilean dissidents, it was a signal that Condor's reach now extended into North America. The secrecy surrounding Operation Condor allowed it to operate with near impunity for years. Governments denied involvement. Media coverage was minimal. Families of the disappeared were met with silence. The victims often had no charges, no trials, and no graves. And because the network was spread across so many countries, accountability was nearly impossible. Each nation could blame another, and borders became a tool of obfuscation rather than protection. Even today, the full extent of Condor's operations remains difficult to trace. Tens of thousands were killed or disappeared during this period across Latin America, and though not all were linked directly to Condor, many fell under its vast web of surveillance and repression. Paper trails were destroyed, witnesses silenced, and official records falsified. The result was a continent haunted by ghosts, missing fathers, brothers, daughters, whose fate was decided not by trial, but by secret memos and whispered orders. Operation Condor wasn't just a military operation, it was a coordinated attack on memory, identity, and truth itself. Its victims weren't only armed rebels or revolutionaries, but teachers, students, artists, journalists, and ordinary citizens whose only crime was believing in a different future. The logic of Condor was simple: eliminate ideas by eliminating the people who carried them. In time, though, the silence began to break. Survivors began to speak. Human rights organizations started to document the atrocities, and in dusty archives, old intelligence files began to resurface, offering glimpses into a conspiracy once considered too vast to be real. As the years passed and the iron grip of the South American dictatorships began to loosen, a painful truth started to emerge. Operation Condor, once a silent pact cloaked in secrecy and diplomatic silence, was being exposed piece by piece. Survivors of detention centers, relatives of the disappeared, and whistleblowers from within the intelligence agencies all began to speak out. What had once been dismissed as rumor or conspiracy was now backed by documents, testimonies, and grave after grave being unearthed across the continent. In Argentina, the fall of the military junta in the early 1980s brought the first serious attempts to hold perpetrators accountable. The famous Trial of the Juntas in 1985 put key leaders of the dictatorship in the dock. Victims described torture chambers, electric shocks, and cells where they were blindfolded for months. Though the initial verdicts were historic, many of those sentenced were later pardoned or released. Still, the door had been opened. Truth commissions formed in Chile, Brazil, and Uruguay, each uncovering fragments of the vast, coordinated repression network that had operated for nearly a decade. One of the most haunting aspects of Operation Condor was the methodical way in which people were made to disappear. These weren't chaotic or impulsive acts of violence, they were planned with bureaucratic precision. Names were typed up on lists, surveillance was conducted quietly, phone lines were tapped, agents waited until their targets were isolated, then they struck. In many cases, people simply vanished in broad daylight, leaving behind confused families and terrified communities. The psychological toll was enormous. For every person abducted, dozens more were left in limbo. Parents who never found their children, spouses who didn't know whether to mourn or hope, and entire neighborhoods gripped by fear. This was repression as a psychological weapon. It taught people to be quiet, to stop asking questions, to keep their heads down. Condor didn't just remove people from life, it erased their existence from the public record. As evidence of cross-border collaboration piled up, new names emerged: American diplomats, European observers, and international banks that had quietly funded some of the regimes. While the full extent of US involvement in Operation Condor is still debated, declassified files show that US intelligence agencies knew about the program as early as 1976. A now famous State Department cable warned that Condor's operations included a coordinated intelligence network and joint operations, including planned assassinations. Still, American support for the regimes continued. The 1990s brought a turning point. As more archives opened and democratic governments took power, the public began to demand justice. Families of the disappeared marched every week in Argentina's Plaza de Mayo. Former agents were arrested and slowly tried. Investigators found mass graves, some filled with the remains of people who had vanished 20 years earlier. One of the most critical breakthroughs came in Paraguay in 1992, when a human rights lawyer stumbled upon what became known as the Archives of Terror, a trove of over 700,000 documents detailing decades of secret police activity under Condor. These papers confirmed everything: The existence of the network, the names of the victims, the code names of operatives, even transcripts of interrogations. It was undeniable. Operation Condor had been real, vast, and deadly. But even with overwhelming evidence, accountability proved difficult. Some of the architects of Condor lived out their lives untouched, protected by legal loopholes, aging in quiet exile. Others were extradited and sentenced, decades too late for the victims, but a victory nonetheless for history and truth. Countries like Argentina began prosecuting crimes against humanity without statutes of limitation. Trials stretched on for years, uncovering the complex machinery of state terror, one witness at a time. Today, Operation Condor remains a warning, a reminder that fear, when institutionalized, becomes a system, that borders are no barrier to oppression when leaders are united in paranoia and cruelty, and that justice, though delayed, can still cut through the fog of secrecy if people are willing to dig deep enough. In the depths of the Pacific Ocean, under miles of cold, dark water, a top-secret mission unfolded that sounded more like a spy thriller than a historical event. Its name was Project Azorian, and its goal was almost unthinkable: raise a sunken Soviet submarine from the bottom of the sea, without anyone finding out. The year was 1974, and in the midst of the Cold War, secrecy wasn't just important, it was everything. The submarine in question, known as K-129, had gone missing in 1968. It was a Soviet ballistic missile sub, capable of launching nuclear weapons, and it vanished somewhere in the North Pacific under mysterious circumstances. The Soviets searched for it desperately, but came up empty. What they didn't know was that the United States had found it first. Using undersea surveillance and satellite intelligence, American naval forces located the wreck nearly 16,000 feet below the surface, far deeper than any traditional recovery operation had ever attempted. Rather than simply observe or take photos, the CIA proposed something bold, unprecedented even by their standards. They wanted to salvage the submarine, haul it to the surface, and recover whatever secrets it still held. The idea wasn't just about recovering weapons or documents, it was about cracking open a Soviet nuclear vessel and peering straight into the heart of Cold War military technology. But to do that without sparking an international crisis, the operation had to be buried under layers of deception. Enter billionaire Howard Hughes, or at least his name. The CIA partnered with Hughes to create a front operation. They claimed they were building a massive ship, the Glomar Explorer, to mine manganese nodules from the ocean floor. This futuristic deep-sea mining cover story was perfect. It explained the massive scale of the ship, the heavy-duty equipment, and the interest in a remote area of the ocean. In reality, the Glomar Explorer was being outfitted with one of the most advanced recovery systems ever engineered, a claw-like mechanical device called the Capture Vehicle, or simply the Claw, designed to reach down into the crushing depths and lift part of the submarine hull. The engineering challenges were staggering. K-129 lay over 3 miles beneath the surface. At that depth, the pressure is so intense it could crush a human body in seconds. The Claw had to descend with precise control, lock onto a rusting, broken hull and lift it without it breaking apart. The mechanics were mind-boggling, and the risks were enormous. One wrong move, and not only would the mission fail, the entire operation could be exposed to the world. Yet by 1974, after years of planning, construction and testing, Project Azorian was ready. The Glomar Explorer sailed to the recovery site in total secrecy, its crew sworn to silence. They weren't just up against nature, they were racing against Soviet surveillance. The CIA feared that Soviet ships or satellites might notice what was happening and interfere, potentially turning a recovery mission into a Cold War standoff on the high seas. As the operation got underway, the massive Claw was lowered over 16,000 feet into the ocean. It latched onto a section of the submarine's hull, and the slow, painstaking process of raising it began. For days, tension ran high as the Claw inched upward, pulling tons of steel and Cold War secrets from the seafloor. The hope was to recover missile tubes, cipher machines, and possibly codebooks, anything that could give the US an edge in the global game of nuclear chess. But somewhere during the ascent, disaster struck. According to later reports, a section of the submarine broke apart and a large portion of it slipped back into the depths. The claw, under immense strain, simply couldn't hold the weight. It was a devastating moment. Only a partial recovery was possible. The CIA managed to retrieve a smaller section of the sub, but not the full payload of secrets they had hoped for. Still, what they did bring up was enough to be considered a technical triumph. Project Azorian had pushed the limits of engineering and espionage, accomplishing what many thought was impossible. Even though the mission was only partially successful, it proved that the US had the capability to operate in total secrecy at the ocean's deepest points and recover objects no one else could reach. And for a while, no one knew. The public had no idea a Soviet nuclear sub had been lifted off the ocean floor by a ship built under a fake mining company, paid for with government black budget funds, and masked by one of the most elaborate cover stories in intelligence history. The mission remained classified, buried in shadows and whispers, exactly the way the CIA liked it. Though the public remained unaware, inside intelligence circles, the partial success of Project Azorian created a ripple of awe. No mission of that magnitude had ever been attempted, let alone kept hidden so effectively. But even as the CIA analysed the recovered material from the wreckage of K-129, a problem was already brewing. Secrecy, as it turns out, has a short shelf life, especially when people start asking questions. In 1975, journalists began to catch wind of something strange about the Glomar Explorer. It wasn't acting like a mining ship. It had been spotted at sea for months, surrounded by unusual secrecy. Reporters from the Los Angeles Times and New York Times began digging. Rumors surfaced of a massive recovery operation involving the CIA, Howard Hughes, and a sunken Soviet sub. The story was too explosive to ignore. When a journalist filed a Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) request to confirm the operation, the CIA responded with a phrase that would go down in history: "We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of the information requested." This became known as the Glomar response, and it set a precedent still used by government agencies today when dealing with sensitive information. In other words, the CIA didn't admit to anything, but also didn't deny it. Despite the non-answer, leaks began to spread. The media gradually pieced together the truth. While most of the technical details remained classified, the basic outline of the operation was laid bare. The US had attempted to raise a Soviet nuclear submarine from the Pacific Ocean under the guise of a mining expedition, using one of the most advanced ships ever built, and it had all been paid for with black budget funds, money Congress rarely scrutinized. In the aftermath, debate raged over what had really been gained. Some reports suggested that the CIA had recovered 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, portions of the hull, and perhaps some cryptographic material. Others insisted the more sensitive parts of the sub, including its missile control systems and codebooks, were lost when the hull broke apart during the lift. The CIA has never confirmed exactly what was recovered, fueling speculation for decades. Adding a deeply human layer to the operation was the crew of K-129. When the CIA brought up the recovered section of the sub, they reportedly found the remains of 6 Soviet sailors inside. In a rare act of respect between Cold War enemies, the agency conducted a military-style burial at sea. Footage of the ceremony, long classified, was eventually released years later, showing American sailors standing at attention as a Soviet anthem played and the remains were lowered back into the ocean. It was a solemn reminder that beneath the high-stakes espionage were real lives, real deaths, and a tragedy that crossed national lines. Over time, Project Azorian came to symbolize both the ambition and secrecy of Cold War intelligence. It showcased the incredible lengths to which the United States would go to gain an advantage over the Soviet Union. It also highlighted the moral gray zones that intelligence work often inhabits: deception, unaccounted spending, covert engineering projects, and missions that bypass diplomatic norms entirely. The Glomar explorer itself became a legend in maritime and intelligence history. After the operation, it sat unused for a time before being converted for actual commercial use. Eventually, it was sold off to private companies. But for those who knew its origins, the ship was never just a vessel. It was a symbol of Cold War cunning, technological ambition, and a mission so bold it could have been lifted straight from the pages of a spy novel. Even today, much about Project Azorian remains classified. Declassified memos and testimonies have shed light on parts of the mission, but many technical and operational details are still locked away. What was recovered, what was lost, and how close the operation came to complete success remains a subject of debate among historians and intelligence experts. In the summer of 1953, something strange happened in Iran. Crowds flooded the streets, shouting, waving banners, and calling for the return of their monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. But behind the chaos and cries for royalty, something else was unfolding, a covert web of manipulation, sabotage, and foreign influence. It wasn't a local revolution, it was a coup orchestrated from the shadows. Its name? Operation AJAX, a CIA and MI6. Backed mission that changed the course of Middle Eastern history forever. To understand Operation Ajax, we have to go back to the years just after World War II. Iran, rich in oil and strategically located, had always attracted foreign attention. British companies, particularly the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later became BP, controlled Iran's oil industry and took the lion's share of the profits. Iranians, however, saw little benefit from the wealth being pumped out of their land. Then came a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, a tall, charismatic and fiercely nationalist politician who rose to become Iran's prime minister in 1951. His message was simple: Iran's resources should serve Iranians. With immense public support, he nationalized the oil industry, kicking out the British oil companies. To many in Iran, it was a bold stand against colonial exploitation. To Britain, it was a threat to their global interests. And to the United States, it was an emerging problem during the height of the Cold War. At first, America wasn't eager to get involved. President Truman had even shown sympathy toward Mossadegh's democratic vision. But things changed quickly when Dwight D. Eisenhower took office in 1953. Influenced by British intelligence and his own team of hardline anti-communists, Eisenhower's administration became convinced that Mossadegh was a danger, not just to Western oil interests, but potentially a doorway for Soviet influence in the region. Mossadegh wasn't a communist, but he had allied with leftist groups and allowed the Iranian Communist Party, Tudeh, to operate freely. That was enough to raise alarms. So, a secret plan was formed, Operation AJAX, authorized by the CIA under Director Alan Dulles, with coordination from the British intelligence agency MI6. Leading the American side of the operation was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt and a rising star in the CIA. His mission was clear: remove Mossadegh, restore the Shah to full power, and protect Western control of Iranian oil without leaving fingerprints. The operation began with precision and subtlety. It wasn't about military might. Instead, the CIA used tools of manipulation: propaganda, bribery, and staged unrest. Iranian newspapers suddenly began printing articles painting Mossadegh as unstable, corrupt, and secretly aligned with communists. Fake anti-government protests were organized. Mobs were paid to riot in the streets. Clerics were encouraged to preach against Mossadegh from the mosques. Even police officers and military officials were bribed or coerced to turn against the prime minister. For a time, Mossadegh resisted the pressure. He remained popular and refused to back down, even when the Shah fled Iran out of fear. But slowly, the chaos deepened. The CIA-backed crowds became more aggressive. Protests turned into street battles. The army, once loyal to Mossadegh, began to shift its allegiance. Then, on August 19th, 1953, the plan reached its climax. Backed by CYA funding and British coordination, military units stormed Mossadegh's home, arresting him after a brief resistance. The streets of Tehran were filled with smoke, chants, and confusion. Within hours, the Shah was flown back to Iran, hailed by orchestrated crowds as the nation's savior. The coup was complete. Operation AJAX had succeeded. Mossadegh was put on trial and later placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. The Shah, now empowered with full authoritarian control, cracked down on dissent, outlawed opposition parties, and established a brutal internal security service known as SAVAK, trained in part by the CIA and Mossad. To the American and British governments, it was a quiet victory. Oil flowed once again into Western hands, and the Soviet Union was kept at bay. But beneath that surface lay the beginning of a much deeper problem. Many Iranians saw what had happened for what it was: a foreign-imposed coup that crushed their democracy. Seeds of resentment were planted, seeds that would grow over the next 2 decades into a revolution. In the days following the 1953 coup, Tehran was eerily calm. The Shah returned from exile, his face appearing in every newspaper, on every radio broadcast, praised as the true leader of Iran. But beneath the surface, many Iranians were furious and frightened. The dream of a democratic Iran had been smothered by outside hands, yet few dared to speak. SAVAK, the Shah's newly formed secret police, made sure of that. Created with help from the CIA and Israel's Mossad, SAVAK wasn't just a surveillance agency. It was a tool of terror. People disappeared. Newspapers were censored. Dissenting voices, whether in universities, mosques or living rooms, were silenced. Fear became a part of daily life. And while the Shah promised modernization and progress, it came at a steep cost: political freedom. Meanwhile, in Washington and London, the success of Operation Ajax was seen as a masterstroke. The CIA had pulled off a regime change without a single American boot on the ground. The oil fields were once again under Western control. But what the architects of the coup didn't anticipate was the deep psychological scar it left behind, a wound that would fester for decades. Iran had been on the verge of charting its own future. Mossadegh wasn't perfect, no politician is, but he had become a symbol of independence. By toppling him, foreign powers had sent a clear message: self-determination was not allowed if it clashed with Western interests. Over the next 2 decades, the Shah ruled with increasing authoritarianism. He launched grand development programs, opened up to the West, and presented himself as a modernizing monarch. But many Iranians saw through the glittering surface. The wealth remained concentrated in the hands of a few. The rural poor were neglected. Religious leaders, once respected figures in Iranian life, were pushed to the margins or labeled threats. And yet, for many years, the West continued to support the Shah. To the United States, he was a valuable ally in the Cold War. Secular, anti-communist, and sitting on massive reserves of oil. President after president praised him. He bought American weapons, signed oil deals, and maintained strong diplomatic ties. But all the while, resentment simmered. By the 1970s, that resentment turned into action. Protests erupted across the country, led by students, clerics, and everyday citizens. The Shah responded with force, but it only deepened the anger. People remembered 1953. They remembered how their first taste of democracy had been crushed by outside powers. In 1979, it all boiled over. The Iranian Revolution swept the Shah from power, and in a twist of irony, the new regime was everything the West feared: anti-American, theocratic, and deeply suspicious of foreign influence. Ayatollah Khomeini, the revolution's spiritual leader, blamed the United States for decades of exploitation, pointing directly to Operation Ajax as the beginning of the rot. Then came the hostage crisis. In November 1979, radical students stormed the US Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. To many Americans, it was a shocking act of aggression. But to the revolutionaries, it was revenge. Revenge for decades of interference, and especially for that day in August 1953, when their democracy was stolen in silence. Even decades later, the effects of Operation AJAX still echo. US-Iran relations remained strained. Trust, if it ever existed, was broken that summer. What was meant to be a quick solution to a Cold War problem became the foundation for generations of suspicion, hostility, and misunderstanding. And for the CIA, AJAX became both a template and a warning. It inspired future covert interventions in places like Guatemala, Chile, and the Congo. But it also revealed the long-term dangers of such actions. You can control events for a moment, but never the memory they leave behind. In recent years, even US officials have begun to acknowledge the consequences. In 2013, on the 60th anniversary of the coup, the CIA finally declassified documents confirming its role in Operation AJAX. The language was clear: the coup was carried out under CIA direction as an act of US foreign policy. But for many Iranians, the acknowledgement came too late. The damage was done, the trust long gone. And the question still lingers: what might Iran have become if it had been allowed to follow its own path? Operation Ajax wasn't just a coup, it was a turning point. A story of oil, fear, and power, wrapped in secrecy and betrayal. And though the newspapers of 1953 called it a victory, history whispers a more complicated truth. In the heart of Africa, the Congo was once a colony of Belgium, bled dry for its resources and ruled through fear. But by 1960, the tide of decolonization had reached the Congo River, and a new face emerged in African politics: Patrice Lumumba. Charismatic, sharp-tongued, and fiercely independent, Lumumba became the country's first democratically elected prime minister after its independence on June 30th, 1960. He spoke with the kind of fire that shook both colonial powers and Cold War giants. But behind the global applause and celebration of a new nation was a silent war, one that would make Lumumba a marked man almost instantly. Lumumba's bold independence and refusal to side with either the West or the Soviet bloc didn't sit well with the powers competing for influence in Africa. Though he wasn't a communist, the West feared he could be swayed by the Soviet Union. The CIA labeled him a new African leader who will have to be dealt with. His real crime, in the eyes of Washington and Brussels, was trying to control his own country's vast mineral wealth without handing the reins to foreign corporations or Cold War alliances. The situation inside the Congo deteriorated quickly. Just days after independence, the Force Publique, the national army, mutinied against their mostly white Belgian officers. Belgium, citing a need to protect its citizens, sent in troops without Congolese consent. The mineral-rich province of Katanga declared secession, backed by Belgian mining interests. Suddenly, the new nation was on the brink of collapse. Lumumba, desperate to hold the Congo together, turned to the United Nations for help. But the UN, under pressure from Western nations, refused to assist in quelling the Katangan rebellion. Frustrated and cornered, Lumumba looked east to the Soviet Union. The USSR sent logistical support, but this only deepened the suspicion in Washington and London. Lumumba's appeal to the Soviets became the final straw. The CIA sprang into action. Declassified documents later revealed just how determined the agency was to eliminate him. CIA Director Alan Dulles described Lumumba as a potential African Castro. The agency drew up plans for his assassination, including poisoning. One idea involved smuggling toothpaste laced with a lethal toxin. A CIA scientist, Sidney Gottlieb, the same man who orchestrated MKUltra, was allegedly sent to Africa with poison in hand. The toothpaste plot never came to fruition, but the intent was crystal clear. Lumumba had to go. Meanwhile, Congolese politics descended into chaos. President Joseph Kasavubu dismissed Lumumba from office, but Lumumba declared the move unconstitutional. Army Chief of Staff Joseph Mobutu, who had once been Lumumba's ally, seized power in a Western-backed coup. Lumumba was placed under house arrest, yet still retained massive support from the Congolese people, especially in the eastern provinces. Under heavy pressure and with rumours swirling of foreign involvement, Lumumba attempted to escape to Stanleyville, where his supporters held sway. It was a desperate move. As he and his convoy crossed the jungle roads, Mobutu's forces caught up with them. Lumumba was arrested and paraded before the cameras, humiliated, bound and beaten. Even then he maintained his composure and refused to bow. But the drama was far from over. The CIA had found its proxy in Mobutu, and Belgian operatives were watching every move. Lumumba's very presence was seen as a threat to the new pro-Western government. There could be no trial, no tribunal, only silence. In a decision cloaked in secrecy, Lumumba was transferred to the secessionist region of Katanga, the very breakaway province he had fought so hard to suppress. His enemies now had full control. In the early days of 1961, Lumumba was taken to a remote house outside Elizabethville, the Katangan capital. He was tortured, mercilessly, and then executed by a firing squad that included Belgian officers. It was a brutal, unceremonious end for the man who had once stood before the world demanding dignity for his people. But the story didn't end there. Lumumba's body was cut up, dissolved in acid, and his remains buried and then exhumed. Belgian officials even kept some of his teeth as grotesque souvenirs. The goal was clear: erase every trace, deny a grave, deny a symbol. But despite every effort to erase him, Lumumba became a martyr, a ghost who would haunt the conscience of nations that had helped orchestrate his fall. Lumumba's imprisonment at the hands of Mobutu's forces was shrouded in secrecy and deception. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba was flown under heavy guard to Katanga, the breakaway province ruled by the hostile secessionist leader Moise Tshombe. Katanga was supported both financially and militarily by Belgian interests, and Lumumba's presence there was far from accidental. It was a calculated move. The regime in Katanga saw Lumumba not as a prisoner, but as an existential threat, one that needed to be eliminated before he could regain popular support or international sympathy. What followed remains one of the most shameful chapters in Cold War history. Upon his arrival in Katanga, Lumumba was beaten and tortured by soldiers loyal to Tshombe. Belgian officers were reportedly present and complicit, if not directly participating, in the abuse. Hours later, Lumumba was executed by firing squad. His body, along with two of his close political allies, was buried, exhumed, dismembered, dissolved in acid, and finally burned, all in a frenzied attempt to erase every physical trace of his existence. But news of his murder could not be hidden for long. The international community reacted with shock and outrage. Protests broke out in many countries. The Soviet Union condemned the assassination as Western imperialism at its most violent, and across Africa, Lumumba's name began to symbolize anti-colonial resistance and martyrdom. But Western governments remained relatively quiet. Officially, Belgium and the United States denied any role in the killing, yet documents and investigations over the years tell a different story. In 2001, a Belgian parliamentary inquiry concluded that Belgian officials were morally responsible for Lumumba's death. Declassified CIA documents also reveal that the US government was deeply involved in plans to remove Lumumba from power, though whether they directly ordered the execution remains murky. What's clear, however, is that both the CIA and Belgian authorities viewed Lumumba as a dangerous man, not because he was corrupt or incompetent, but because he was too independent, too popular, and too determined to put Congo's future in the hands of its own people. The rationale behind eliminating Lumumba had everything to do with control of the Congo's immense natural wealth, especially uranium, cobalt, and diamonds. The Cold War powers were terrified that such resources could fall under Soviet influence if Lumumba remained in power. And so, in the name of stability, they backed coups, funded rival leaders, and ultimately stood by, or directly assisted, as one of Africa's most promising leaders was destroyed. Lumumba's legacy did not end with his death. In fact, his memory became a powerful rallying cry for generations of Africans fighting neo-colonialism and dictatorship. Schools, streets, and even children bore his name. Artists, musicians, and poets from across the world paid tribute to his life and sacrifice. He had become larger than life, a symbol of hope and betrayal, courage and conspiracy. And yet, the nation he dreamed of never fully materialized. After his death, Mobutu Sese Seko consolidated power with the backing of the US, establishing a brutal dictatorship that would last over 3 decades. The Congo was renamed Zaire, and democracy was replaced with kleptocracy. The same foreign powers that had feared Lumumba now embraced Mobutu, who offered them access to resources in exchange for silence on his crimes. For years, the story of Lumumba's death was kept out of mainstream history books, but the truth has a way of resurfacing. Today, as new generations revisit Cold War history, Lumumba's story is being re-examined, not just as a tragedy of the past, but as a warning for the present. His assassination wasn't a momentary lapse in moral judgment. It was a deliberate decision made by nations that prioritized geopolitical advantage over justice and economics over ethics. In recent years, Belgium has taken cautious steps to acknowledge its colonial crimes, even returning one of Lumumba's teeth, recovered from a Belgian officer who had taken it as a grim trophy, to his family for a proper burial. Yet no one has been truly held accountable, and the scars left behind by his murder on Congo, on Africa, on the world, remain raw. Patrice Lumumba's story is not just a tale of what was lost, but a reminder of what was feared. A black man, educated, charismatic, visionary, and uncompromising, daring to chart a sovereign path for his country in a world that wasn't ready to let go of its empire. His fall wasn't inevitable, it was orchestrated, and in that orchestration lies a truth that continues to echo today. In the dense fog of Cold War politics, facts often drowned in a sea of rumours, fabrications, and shadowy agendas. But few stories showcase the murky tactics of that era quite like the Bulgarian Contract, a narrative that gripped the world in the early 1980s and still raises eyebrows today. It began with a shocking act of violence that stunned the globe, the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II. On May 13, 1981, St. Peter's Square in Vatican City was filled with thousands of faithful. As Pope John Paul II rode through the crowd in an open vehicle, 3 shots rang out. Chaos erupted. The Pope slumped, wounded, as onlookers screamed. Moments later, a man was subdued by security. He was identified as Mehmet Ali Arka, a Turkish national with a criminal background and known connections to extremist groups. Arka had a murky past. He'd previously escaped from prison in Turkey after being convicted for the murder of a journalist. His motives for targeting the Pope were unclear, and when questioned, he offered a tangled web of stories. But then, a new theory emerged, one that would spark international tension and shift the blame in an entirely different direction. Western intelligence and media began to circulate a stunning claim that the Soviet Union, through its satellite state Bulgaria, had ordered the hit, the alleged motive, Pope John Paul II's support for the Solidarity movement in Poland. Solidarity, a trade union turned political force, posed a direct challenge to communist control in Eastern Europe, and the Pope, himself Polish, had lent them moral and spiritual support. The theory, dubbed the Bulgarian Connection, caught fire. Arka, now behind bars, suddenly began pointing fingers at Bulgarian agents, claiming he had been recruited by them to carry out the attack. Western newspapers ran headlines with shadowy silhouettes of KGB officers and Bulgarian spies. The CIA was said to be investigating. Bulgaria naturally denied everything, but the mere suggestion was enough to deepen Cold War fears. At the heart of this narrative stood Sergei Antonov, a Bulgarian airline official working in Rome. He was arrested and accused of being Arka's contact and co-conspirator. Along with 2 other Bulgarians, Antonov became the face of the alleged Soviet plot. Italy prepared for one of the most sensational trials of the decade. The world watched with bated breath. Would this confirm that the USSR had orchestrated an assassination attempt on the Pope? But as the months passed, cracks began to form. The evidence against Antonov was thin, mostly circumstantial and based heavily on Arka's own shifting, contradictory testimony. He changed his story multiple times, even retracting parts of it entirely. Experts began to question his credibility. Italian investigators admitted they had no physical evidence linking Antonov to the crime. Still, the trial went on, fueled more by Cold War politics than clear-cut proof. In 1986, after a long and dramatic courtroom process, Antonov and the other Bulgarian suspects were acquitted. The judge ruled that there was simply not enough evidence to support the charges. The so-called Bulgarian connection crumbled under scrutiny, but the damage had already been done. For years, the story had painted a narrative of communist villainy, fueling Western suspicion and propaganda. Behind the scenes, many began to suspect that the Bulgarian link was a fabrication, an intelligence operation designed to smear the Soviet bloc. Declassified documents and journalist investigations in later years would suggest that the CIA and other Western agencies may have quietly encouraged the theory, hoping to weaken Soviet influence by tying them to an act of terror against the head of the Catholic Church. In essence, the Bulgarian contract wasn't just a failed assassination theory, it was a masterclass in Cold War disinformation, the kind where perception mattered more than proof, and a well-timed story could shape public opinion for years. But how did this narrative take hold so quickly? Who stood to gain from the spread of such a theory? And why did Arca, unstable and unreliable, suddenly become the mouthpiece for a geopolitical accusation? These questions lead deeper into the strange intersections of espionage, religion, and Cold War rivalry. The assassination attempt was real, but the story told about it, that was something else entirely. To understand why the Bulgarian contract gained so much traction, we need to examine the context in which it emerged. The early 1980s were a tense time in global politics. The Soviet Union was struggling economically and politically. In Poland, the rise of the Solidarity movement, championed by a deeply religious population and supported by a Polish pope, threatened Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. For the Kremlin, this wasn't just dissent, it was contagion. On the other side, the United States under President Ronald Reagan was doubling down on anti-communist rhetoric. Reagan had labeled the Soviet Union the evil empire. His administration viewed any chance to expose or weaken Soviet power as a strategic win. It was a time of arms races, proxy wars, and espionage. So when Pope John Paul II was shot, suspicion fell naturally on Moscow, even if the evidence didn't. The press played a critical role. Western newspapers picked up the Bulgarian link quickly, giving it front-page status. Political commentators and even some intelligence officials spoke with certainty about Bulgarian involvement, despite the lack of concrete proof. Newsweek ran articles about shadowy Eastern Bloc operatives in Rome. The story had the perfect ingredients: an assassination attempt, the Vatican, the KGB, and Cold War paranoia. Truth, it seemed, was optional. Yet behind the scenes, skepticism was growing. Journalists and independent investigators began digging deeper. They found contradictions in Arca's story. One week he claimed to have met Bulgarian handlers in Rome. The next, he said he'd never seen them. His behaviour was erratic, sometimes even theatrical. In court, he once declared himself the second coming of Christ. He made wild claims that couldn't be verified and accused people at random. Still, the trial proceeded. Italian prosecutors under pressure clung to the theory, but the judge wasn't convinced. After 3 years, the verdict was in. Not guilty. The evidence simply didn't add up. The accused Bulgarians went free, and the so-called contract vanished into the fog it came from. Yet even in acquittal, the damage endured. Sergei Antonov returned to Bulgaria a broken man, shunned and deeply depressed. He never recovered from the ordeal. Publicly accused of trying to kill the Pope, his name remained tainted, even without a conviction. In Bulgaria, his trial was seen as a symbol of the West's willingness to demonize the East, based on rumor and political need. Years later, new light was shed on the affair. In the 1990s and early 2000s, former intelligence agents and declassified materials painted a more nuanced picture. Some suggested that Arca's initial claim about Bulgarian involvement had been planted or encouraged, perhaps not by a formal CIA directive, but by a general push in intelligence circles to connect Soviet-backed entities to global terrorism. The Cold War was not just a battle of armies and missiles, it was a war of ideas and stories. The narrative of the Bulgarian connection fit neatly into the West's playbook. It cast communism as not only oppressive but violent and subversive. It made for compelling headlines and gave ideological ammunition to the anti-Soviet cause. But not everyone agreed. Scholars and researchers began to argue that the Bulgarian plot was a classic example of disinformation, weaponized rumor. Some pointed out that Western intelligence had a history of amplifying half-truths to stir dissent within the Eastern Bloc. Others noted that Arca may have made the claims to gain leverage, attention, or even protection in prison. In retrospect, the Bulgarian contract remains a symbol of Cold War distortion, a tale where political theatre often mattered more than legal truth. It reminds us how quickly a story can spread when it feeds into existing fears, and how difficult it is to correct the record once it takes root in the public mind. Today, the attempt on Pope John Paul II is remembered for its violence, but the story around it, the trial, the accusations, the supposed international conspiracy, has become a case study in propaganda. It shows how intelligence, ideology, and media can combine to create a truth that isn't true, but feels true enough to shape history.